At 6:12 in the morning on April 3, 1944, Captain Thomas Earl Danforth, 24 years old, 47 combat missions behind him, feels his radio die in the middle of a sentence. 24,000 feet above the Bismarck Sea, in the cockpit of a twin-boomed Lockheed P-38G Lightning named Iron Bride, the last word he hears before the static swallows everything is his wingman's call sign, cut clean in half. The set weighs 18 pounds, built from 412 components, and somewhere inside that housing a burned coil or a severed lead has gone silent forever. He taps the panel twice, out of habit more than hope. He checks the circuit breaker, resets it, waits 3 full seconds for the tubes to warm and hum back to life. Nothing answers. He tries the emergency frequency next, the one reserved for exactly this kind of failure, and gets the same dead hiss in return. Above him, the cloud deck has closed to a gray ceiling at 26,000 feet, and below him, through a gap in the weather, 24 B-25 Mitchell bombers hold formation on a heading for Rabaul. He can see them. He cannot talk to them, and for the next several hours he cannot talk to anyone at all. 144 men are flying inside those 24 bombers, 6 to an aircraft, pilot, co-pilot, navigator, radio man, and 2 gunners apiece. Not statistics. Not mission parameters. 144 men who have already survived a war that kills the unlucky and the careless in equal measure. Men with families waiting in Ohio and Montana and Wisconsin and Texas. Men who do not know that the fighter assigned to watch their tail has just gone deaf and mute at 24,000 feet. 144 men, and for the next hour and change, Danforth is the only thing standing between them and the airfields at Rabaul, where the Japanese Navy keeps some of its best pilots on permanent alert, flying out of a base that has already survived 6 American bombing raids this month alone. The mission is simple to state and brutal to execute. Escort the bomber stream to the harbor at Rabaul, hold formation through the bomb run, and bring every Mitchell home. The threat waiting for them is not simple at all. Rabaul's fighter strength includes the Mitsubishi A6M0, a machine that can turn inside almost anything in the sky, climbing at nearly 3,000 feet per minute, closing on a bomber formation at better than 300 miles an hour. A single well-flown pass from an experienced Zero pilot can put 20mm cannon shells through a Mitchell's wing route in under 2 seconds, and a Mitchell carries no armor along that wing route at all. 5 aircraft, flown with skill, can kill 15 bombers in a single engagement, a kill ratio the Japanese Navy has proven capable of more than once this year. 90 men gone before the tail gunners even acquire a target worth answering. That is the arithmetic Danforth carries into the weather with him, whether his radio works or not. Danforth's flight left Nadzab at 5:40 that morning with 4 aircraft, briefed as a single unit 30 minutes before engine start. First Lieutenant Walter Hayes Prout, 23 years old, from Lubbock, Texas, flies element lead off Danforth's right wing. Prout has 211 rounds of confirmed gun camera footage logged against his name from 6 separate engagements, and a habit of tapping his instrument panel 3 times before every takeoff, a ritual none of the others have ever teased him about twice. Second Lieutenant Samuel Otis Reyes, 22, the newest pilot in the squadron, flies tail-end position, still logging only his 9th combat sortie, known across the ready room for whistling off-key over an open radio channel until someone tells him to knock it off. First Lieutenant Charles Foster Meade, 25, the flight's elder statesman at 4 years older than the others and already carrying 81 combat missions of his own, keeps a rosary wrapped twice around his throttle quadrant and has never once explained why. At the pre-mission briefing, 32 minutes before engine start, Danforth ran the roster himself name by name. Prout, here. Reyes, here, sir. Meade, A short nod, nothing more. 3 names, 3 answers, 3 men who now, 24,000 feet above the Bismarck Sea, cannot hear a single word he says. The machine-to-machine math is not close, and it never has been. A P-38G tops out near 400 miles an hour in level flight, against a Zero's roughly 330, and the Lightning carries a devastating concentration of nose armament. 1 20mm cannon and 4 50 caliber machine guns, all firing straight ahead with no convergence angle to compensate for. But the Lightning weighs nearly twice what a Zero weighs, close to 12,000 pounds fully loaded against the Zero's 5,400, and that weight costs it dearly in a turning fight. Its turn radius runs nearly double the Zero's tightest circle, and at altitudes above 20,000 feet, a Zero can outclimb it by roughly 600 feet per minute. Danforth's one real advantage has always been coordination, 4 aircraft working a single Zero as a team, boxing it, forcing it into a vertical dive where the Lightning's speed and diving weight finally become an asset instead of a liability. That advantage lived entirely inside a radio set that has just gone dead, 18 pounds of silent metal bolted behind his seat. The temperature at altitude reads 11 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. His breath fogs the inside of his oxygen mask in a thin gray film that keeps refreezing along the rubber seal, and every 4th or 5th breath, he has to crack the mask an inch to knock the ice loose before it seals shut entirely. Through the canopy, the cloud has thickened to the point where he can see Prout's Lightning only as a smear of olive drab off his right wingtip, and Ray's and Meade have vanished into the gray entirely, somewhere behind and above, invisible. His fingers have gone numb inside his gloves down to the second knuckle, and he flexes them against the control yoke every few seconds just to keep enough feeling to fly precisely. The instrument panel glows a dull amber in the weak morning light, 31 gauges and dials arranged in 3 tight rows, and every needle on it is telling him the same thing. He is alone, and he is about to get more alone. The fuel gauge reads 300 gallons, the total remaining after the drop tanks were released 20 minutes ago over the strait. At current cruise power, that number will fall in a straight line for the next hour, and there is no way to call for a tanker rendezvous or a diverted heading if it falls too fast. Then a second problem announces itself before the first has even settled. The left engine's oil pressure gauge, steady at 70 pounds per square inch since takeoff, drops to 58 in the span of 90 seconds, the needle twitching downward in small, uneven jumps that mean a slow leak somewhere in the line, not a catastrophic failure yet, but a clock now running underneath every other clock. He has, by rough calculation, perhaps 40 minutes before that engine either stabilizes or seizes outright. Then the weather takes the last of his options away entirely. A downdraft catches Iron Bride's left boom and drops the aircraft 40 feet in under 2 seconds, and by the time Danforth wrestles it level again, Prout's wing has disappeared into the cloud along with everyone else. He banks north, toward where the formation should be. He finds only gray in every direction for 11 full seconds before he levels the wings and accepts it. Doctrine has an answer for this. Standing orders are explicit. A fighter that loses radio contact and visual contact with its flight is to abort, climb above the weather, and return independently to Nadzeb. The regulation exists because a lone P-38 with no radio and a failing oil line is a fighter that cannot call for help, cannot warn a bomber formation of an incoming threat, and cannot coordinate a rescue if it goes down over open water. Statistically, single aircraft separated in weather over the Bismarck Sea have roughly a 1 in 5 chance of simply never being found, their wreckage and their pilots lost to a stretch of ocean that swallows evidence completely. Every instructor who ever put Danforth through advanced gunnery school would tell him, without hesitation, to turn for home right now. But the other 3 fighters assigned to this mission are somewhere in this same cloud, just as blind, and the next flight of lightning scheduled to relieve them is 40 minutes and 90 miles behind, still climbing out of Nadzab. If Danforth turns back, the bombers reach Rabaul with no escort at all, not reduced escort, none. His hands stay on the controls, steady despite everything the last few minutes have thrown at him. His pulse, if he checked it, would read close to 130 beats a minute, high enough that he can feel it in his own throat over the drone of both engines. Somewhere below him, he can still make out the shapes of the Mitchells, holding their heading, utterly unaware that the 4 fighters they believe are watching over them have collapsed down to 1. He runs the calculation one final time: 90 minutes of fuel, a leaking oil line, no radio, no wingmen, and 144 men who will fly into contested airspace with nothing between them and Rabaul's fighters unless he stays exactly where he is. He says it out loud, alone in the cockpit to no one at all. Then I'll be 4 fighters. He is not breaking off. If you want to see how Danforth pulled off what happens next, hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Danforth, alone above the clouds, 24,000 feet over the Bismarck Sea. With no radio and no flight, Danforth improvises the only tool he has left: noise and position. He drops through a gap in the cloud to 18,000 feet, low enough to keep the bomber stream in constant sight, and begins flying a wide weave a mile off the Mitchell's flank, banking hard enough every 90 seconds that sunlight flashes off his wings. A visual signal any bomber gunner would recognize as "friendly fighter present," the closest thing to a radio call he can still send. It burns fuel he cannot spare, roughly 11 extra gallons every 10 minutes, but a silent, invisible escort is worse than no escort at all if the bomber crews don't know he's there. He throttles back the left engine 400 RPM below the right, letting the airframe yaw slightly, buying a wider field of view out the left side of the canopy where a fighter would normally sit unseen in a pilot's blind spot. It is not doctrine. No manual describes flying escort this way. But it should work, because a lone Zero pilot hunting an unescorted bomber stream looks first for a fighter flying tight and predictable, not one weaving low and wide with an engine deliberately out of sync. There is no crew to coordinate with, no second man to split the workload, so Danforth becomes his own navigator, radio man, and gunner all at once, dead reckoning his heading off a stopwatch and compass, because the ground-based radio beacon he'd normally home in on requires a working receiver he no longer has, scanning the sky in 60-second sweeps left, right, high, low, because there is no one else's eyes to trust. Every task that would normally split 3 ways across a bomber crew falls on one set of hands, adjusting mixture and throttle to compensate for the leaking left engine, logging elapsed time against airspeed to hold a dead-reckoned heading accurate to within 2 degrees, and never once letting his eyes rest on any single quadrant of sky longer than 4 seconds. 20 minutes pass this way. The bombers hold formation below him, unaware how close they came to flying naked into contested airspace, unaware that the fighter weaving above their flank is running on a stopwatch and a busted oil line instead of a functioning radio and a full flight. Fuel reads 240 gallons. Ammunition across his 450 caliber machine guns and single 20mm cannon totals 7,800 rounds, exactly where it started, because he has not yet fired a shot. The oil pressure on the left engine has stabilized at 51 pounds per square inch, leaking, but holding for now. At current burn rate, that fuel gives him roughly 90 minutes of flight time, and Rabaul sits 41 minutes ahead on the bomber stream's present heading. The gap between what he has and what the mission needs is still, for now, in his favor. It will not stay that way. Below him, inside the lead Mitchell, the pilot from Missoula has no idea any of this is happening. He flies straight and level, trusting a fighter escort he cannot see clearly through the cloud, trusting a radio net that has gone quiet in a way he assumes is simply routine. 144 men, spread across 24 aircraft, continue toward Rabaul on the assumption that the sky above and around them is being watched by 4 coordinated fighters working as a single unit, exactly as briefed. Not one of them knows that assumption is now carried entirely by a single pilot, alone, running his own dead-reckoning math with a stopwatch and a compass, because the tool built for exactly this job stopped working 40 minutes ago. For 20 more minutes nothing happens, and the nothing is its own kind of pressure. Danforth holds his weave, holds his heading, watches his fuel and his failing oil pressure tick downward in tandem, and begins to let himself believe the rest of the run to Rabaul might pass without incident. It does not. Kobayashi hears the bomber stream before he sees it. Chief Petty Officer Isamu Kobayashi, 29 years old, 8 confirmed victories logged against his name across 3 years of combat, flies with the 204th Kokutai out of Lakanai Airfield, and he has spent those 3 years learning to read a formation's engine drone through cloud before a single silhouette appears in his gun sight. He climbs his flight of 4 zeros out of Lakanai at 6:51 a.m., vectored by a ground spotter who caught the Mitchell's contrail 40 miles out and radioed a heading, an altitude, and an estimated formation size. Kobayashi is patient, methodical, and very good at his job. He runs a fuel check, an ammunition check, and a formation check before he says a single word to his wingman. He is not hunting for glory. He is defending an airfield that has already been bombed 6 times this month, that has lost 11 aircraft on the ground to earlier raids, and he intends to make today the 7th time an American bombing run doesn't work. At 7:14, bearing 2 o'clock high, closing at roughly 480 miles an hour combined closure speed, Kobayashi's flight breaks out of the cloud deck directly above the bomber stream, and directly into the path of a single P-38 flying an unfamiliar, weaving pattern that none of the 4 Japanese pilots initially identify as a threat worth prioritizing. Tracer fire streaks past Iron Bride's left boom, missing by what Danforth's instincts clock at no more than 30 yards. He has perhaps 4 seconds inside the killing zone of that first pass, 4 seconds in which a single well-placed burst ends everything before it starts. He rolls hard right, pulls 2 positive G, and survives it without firing a shot of his own. The first pass is Kobayashi's, and Kobayashi's flight scores nothing for it. The reversal comes fast. Danforth's earlier weave, the one meant to signal the bombers, left a visible engine exhaust trail against the gray sky, a thin dark smear any trained eye could read at 2 miles, and one of Kobayashi's wingmen reads it instantly, calling it out over his own working radio. A single lightning, alone, weaving, no visible support anywhere in the surrounding sky. Within seconds the hunter has become the hunted. It is not a mistake on Danforth's part so much as the unavoidable cost of making himself visible enough to protect the men below him. The same maneuver that told the bomber crews he was there told the enemy exactly the same thing. Kobayashi's flight, flying disciplined Imperial Navy fighter doctrine down to the letter, splits into a standard 2-pair attack, one element high at roughly 20,000 feet, one low at 16,000, and begins working the position exactly as 3 years of training taught them to, patient and unhurried, certain of the outcome. Danforth's own hands buy the first blood. Pulling up into a scissor against the low pair, he lines a 3-second burst, roughly 140 rounds from his .450 calibers and 11 20mm shells from the cannon, into the belly of the trailing Zero as it commits to a turn it cannot complete. The tracking window lasts barely 2 seconds, his gun sight pipper drifting across the fuselage almost faster than his eye can follow. The Zero's fuel tank, unarmored by American standards, erupts along the wing route, and the aircraft rolls inverted and does not recover, spinning down through 8,000 feet trailing a thin black ribbon of smoke before it strikes the water. 1 down, 3 remaining. Fuel reads 210 gallons, ammunition down to 6,100 rounds, both numbers lower than they were 4 minutes ago and continuing to fall. The cost comes almost immediately after. Kobayashi's second wingman puts a burst of 20mm fire across Iron Bride's left boom, and Danforth feels the airframe shudder as roughly 30% of his rudder authority disappears in a fraction of a second. The left boom's control surface, shredded along its trailing edge in a spray of aluminum. Hydraulic pressure on that side drops from 1,100 pounds per square inch toward zero within moments, the gauge needle sinking steadily as fluid bleeds out through a line he cannot see and cannot reach. He has not hit himself. There is no crewman beside him to lose, no second man's blood to account for. But the machine that has to get him and 144 other men home just lost a third of its ability to turn left, and the oil pressure on his failing left engine, still sitting at 51 pounds per square inch, has not gotten any better. Fuel reads 180 gallons. Ammunition, 5,300 rounds. The honest arithmetic, the kind any flight instructor would recite without hesitation, says he should break off now, nurse a damaged airframe back toward Nadzeb, and let the next relief flight handle whatever comes next. The bombers are still 40 minutes from home, and a pilot flying a crippled aircraft alone, against 2 remaining enemy fighters, with no one to warn him of a threat closing from his blind side, is a pilot playing odds no sane instructor would ever recommend. Kobayashi's remaining 3 Zeros do not let him make the choice cleanly regardless. They split into a textbook killing box, 1 high, 1 low, 1 level off his damaged left side, so that whichever direction Danforth turns, someone already has a firing solution waiting. He has perhaps 6 seconds before all 3 guns can bear on him at once, 6 seconds to decide what the rest of the morning is going to look like. A voice in his own head, the closest thing he has to a crewman right now, runs the recommendation any sane pilot would make. Break off, dive for the cloud deck, live to fly tomorrow. And the recommendation is not wrong. But Danforth runs a different arithmetic instead. 3 Zeros still flying means 3 Zeros still able to reach the bomber stream in the next 90 seconds, and 3 Zeros reaching an unescorted formation of Mitchells means dead crews tonight, and more dead crews the next night, and the night after that. He thinks, without meaning to, of the tail gunner from Toledo, Ohio, who 3 weeks ago showed him a photograph of a daughter he had never held. Of the radio man from Brooklyn who could not stop talking about his mother's Sunday gravy. Of the lead bomber pilot from Missoula, Montana, who flies every mission with his wife's handkerchief folded into his flight jacket. Not because they are fearless, but because they are terrified and fly anyway. Not because they want glory, but because they cannot live with themselves if they quit. Not because they are superhuman, but because they are deeply, perfectly human. He does not break off. What he does instead violates the very limitation that put him in danger in the first place. With rudder authority cut by a third on the left boom, standard doctrine says a hard left turn under combat load risks a snap roll into an unrecoverable spin, the kind that ends with an aircraft tumbling out of the sky with no chance to save it. Danforth uses the failure instead of fighting it, chopping power on the left engine entirely for 2 full seconds, letting asymmetric thrust yaw the aircraft through a turn far tighter than intact rudder authority should allow. A maneuver no flight manual describes, because no flight manual assumes a pilot would deliberately kill an engine mid-combat just to steer with what's left. Airspeed bleeds from 310 miles an hour to 240 in just under 3 seconds, 4 positive G stacking against his chest hard enough to gray the edges of his vision, the stall warning horn screaming through the cockpit the entire time, a sound every instructor he ever had trained him to fear. The Zero pilot on his level flank, who had already committed to a firing pass, assuming a normal turn radius, finds his own gun sight sliding past empty air where an aircraft should have been. The last of the 3, the most patient of them, waits through all of it. He has watched 2 wingmen die and 1 bracket close on nothing, and he adjusts, climbing above Iron Bride's blind spot behind the damaged left boom, the one arc of sky where a pilot fighting yaw and stall warnings and a screaming horn has almost no attention left to spare. He is the best of Kobayashi's flight for a reason, and he does not rush. When he finally commits, it is from the one angle Danforth cannot answer cleanly, and the shot that reaches him tears through the top of his left engine nacelle, the same engine already leaking oil since 6:31 that morning, killing it outright in a burst of gray smoke that streams back past the cockpit. The kill Danforth scores in return comes almost blind, cannon rounds fired on instinct through a gun sight he does not have time to properly settle, catching the Zero's canopy on a snap deflection shot that owes as much to luck as to 3 years of gunnery training. The pilot never bails out. Somewhere in that cockpit is a young man who has a mother, a hometown, a life that ends in this exact second over water he will never be recovered from. War does not allow time for that grief. Not yet. Silence follows, not peace, just the absence of tracer fire and the low, uneven drone of a single working engine where 2 used to be. The accounting that comes next is brutal and immediate, the kind of arithmetic that leaves no room for hope dressed up as optimism. Fuel reads 48 gallons. Altitude, 11,000 feet and falling at 300 feet per minute with 1 engine dead and the other running rough on failing oil pressure. Nadzeb sits roughly 71 miles behind him on his current heading, a distance his remaining fuel cannot cover by a margin of nearly 22 miles by his own dead-reckoning math, worked out on a kneeboard with a stub of pencil while the aircraft continues to sink. He does not have enough left to make it home. Below him, unaware, the 24 Mitchells continue on toward Rabaul, their bomb bay doors still closed, their crews still breathing. The descent that follows is long, and it is measured in numbers all the way down. 10,000 feet, 31 gallons, 190 miles an hour, the coastline still a smudge of green on the horizon. 8,000 feet, 22 gallons, the dead engine's propeller finally windmilling to a stop entirely, the airframe trimmed careful and silent to hold what little glide it has left. 6,000 feet, 16 gallons, the good engine's oil pressure now down to 39 pounds and dropping. 5,000 feet, 14 gallons, the coastline of New Guinea finally visible as a definite green line against the water close, but not close enough by his own math, and Iron Bride's landing gear when he drops the lever, gives him only the left main wheel. The right refuses to lock, hydraulic pressure too low to force it fully home. 3,000 feet, 9 gallons, 150 miles an hour. 2,000 feet, 6 gallons, 130 miles an hour, a stretch of coastal grass strip visible ahead that was never built to receive an aircraft in this condition. He brings it in at 109 miles an hour on 1 working engine, 1 locked wheel, and a rudder that answers only when he asks it gently and patiently. The right wingtip catches the grass first, metal shrieking, sparks trailing 30 yards behind the aircraft as it slews sideways, the whole airframe rotating nearly 90 degrees before it finally shudders to a stop, nose buried slightly in soft ground, one propeller blade bent back against the cowling. No fire, no explosion, just the sudden, ringing knowledge that he is still alive. The strip he has put iron bride down on belongs to a small forward Australian coast-watching outpost, barely more than a cleared field and a radio shack, never intended for anything larger than a liaison aircraft. Ground crews from that forward strip reach him within 11 minutes, alerted by a lookout who watched the whole landing from a ridge above the field, sprinting the 400 yards down to the wreck before the propeller has even finished its final slow rotation. Danforth walks away with 2 cracked ribs, a dislocated shoulder he does not notice until an hour later once the adrenaline finally drains out of him, and a laceration above his left eye that needs 6 stitches from a medic working out of a tent 40 yards from the wreck. A skeptical squadron intelligence officer, hearing a lone pilot's account of downing 3 Zeros with a dead radio and no witnesses, walks the length of Iron Bride's damaged left boom twice, counts the scorch marks around the gun ports, checks the film canister from the nose-mounted gun camera, and still files the claim as unconfirmed, pending corroboration, until Patriot, Reyes, and Meade land separately at Nadzeb 2 hours later, having broken out of the same weather 15 miles south of Danforth's position, and independently report watching 3 distinct columns of black smoke rise from the sea at almost exactly the coordinates Danforth's own account placed them. The gun camera film, developed that same afternoon, confirms the 4th. He is promoted to major within the month and awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, presented at a brief ceremony on the Nadzeb airstrip with his still-healing shoulder wrapped beneath his dress uniform. The citation reading, in part, that he had remained on station in the face of mechanical failure and enemy contact, at extreme personal risk, to preserve the safety of a bomber formation under his protection. Patriot, Reyes, and Meade each receive air medals for holding formation and getting their own aircraft home safely through the same weather that nearly claimed all 4 of them that morning. The bomber group receives a unit citation of its own, framed and hung in a mess hall that would itself be dismantled within 18 months as the war moved on without it. But the sentence that matters more than any medal, the one written into the after-action report in a single flat line, is the simplest one. All 144 men aboard those 24 Mitchells came home that day without a single loss. Walter Hayes Patriot returned to Lubbock after the war, ran a crop-dusting operation for 30 years, married a schoolteacher named Ruth, and raised 3 children who grew up hearing the story only in pieces, usually second-hand, usually years apart. He still tapped the dashboard of his truck 3 times before long drives, a habit his kids never once questioned. Samuel Otis Reyes went home to Sacramento, became an aircraft mechanic specializing in electrical systems, radios, in particular, and told friends for the rest of his life that he'd simply never trusted a wiring harness he hadn't checked twice himself. A small, private rule he passed down to every apprentice who ever worked under him. Charles Foster Meade left the Army Air Forces in 1946, became an iron worker in Pittsburgh, and was known on job sites for working the highest steel without a trace of fear, telling younger men that he'd already met real fear once, at 18,000 feet over open water, and nothing on a construction site since had come close. He kept the same rosary, worn nearly smooth from 3 decades of handling, in his coat pocket for the rest of his life, and he never once explained its significance to anyone who asked, not fully, not the whole story. The tail gunner from Toledo made it home to the daughter in the photograph. She grew up never knowing how close she came to growing up without him, and he never told her. The radio man from Brooklyn spent the rest of his life making his mother's Sunday gravy for his own children, exactly the way she'd taught him, in the same battered pot she'd used. The bomber pilot from Missoula returned his wife's handkerchief to her in person, on the porch of their house, 3 months after that morning over the Bismarck Sea, and neither of them said very much about it at all. The 4 men met exactly 6 times over the following 4 decades, at squadron reunions scattered from Texas to California, hotel banquet halls filled with graying men in blazers with old unit patches sewn on, and by every account they discussed nearly everything: old aircraft, old arguments, old friends lost elsewhere in the war, wives and children, and the slow, ordinary business of growing old, except that single morning in April of 1944. It stayed private between them, honored through silence rather than retelling, the way certain things simply are, understood without ever needing to be spoken aloud again. Thomas Danforth died in 1988 at the age of 68 in Bozeman, Montana, not far from where he was born, and not far from where his own wingmen eventually scattered across the West. His obituary ran 11 lines and mentioned 22 years of military and civilian aviation service, a widow, and 2 grown sons. It did not mention 3 zeros, or a dead radio, or a stretch of grass strip he'd nearly cartwheeled into on one wheel, or 144 men who never knew, and never needed to know, how close they came to flying into Rabaul alone. One photograph survives from that squadron, taken the week before the mission: 4 young pilots in flight jackets, arms slung loosely over one another's shoulders, squinting into New Guinea sunlight, unaware of what waited for one of them a week later over the Bismarck Sea. Danforth stands on the far left, hat pushed back, caught mid-laugh at something out of frame. It hangs today in a small aviation museum in Montana, one black and white frame among hundreds of others just like it, and most visitors who pass it never slow down long enough to read the small typed card beneath it, never learn what happened to the man on the far left on a gray morning in April. But we know, because stories like this deserve to be remembered, told in full, numbers and all. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Every like helps YouTube share it with more people, helps rescue stories like this one from dusty archives and forgotten logbooks that would otherwise sit unread for another 80 years. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because we bring you forgotten stories of real heroism every single day. Stories about ordinary men who made extraordinary choices under conditions most of us will never have to face. And drop a comment telling us where you're watching from: United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, wherever you are. We want to know. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive, part of making sure a name typed on a faded personnel roster doesn't just quietly disappear. Thank you for making sure Thomas Danforth, Walter Prout, Samuel Reyes, and Charles Meade don't disappear into silence. April 3, 1944. A radio failed at 24,000 feet over the Bismarck Sea, and a single fighter pilot with an oil line already leaking and a rudder already damaged flew on alone against 4 enemy aircraft rather than leave 144 men undefended. He shot down 3 of them. He brought a crippled aircraft home on 1 engine, 1 wheel, and a stretch of grass never meant to catch it. He and his 3 wingmen lived out long, quiet lives afterward, in Montana and Texas and California and Pennsylvania, raising families who mostly never knew the full weight of what those men had carried. And now, through this story, their courage lives on. These men deserve to be remembered. You're helping make that happen.